Good morning and welcome to all the people who are logging in. Thank you for joining us. It's 10:59, so we're going to give it a few minutes for some more folks to log in. But we are very glad that you are with us this morning. Yes.
Probably close this one because do you want to just stick with this one or try to see?
Hey, Jessica.
Morning, Jessica. Good morning, Miss Annie.
Good morning. Good morning.
How are you?
I am well. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you all too. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Nicole, would you like me to kick us off here as you let folks in?
Yes. Let's
All
do
right.
it.
Well, officially, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Purnell. I'm the Program Director for Partners in Health and Wholeness with the North Carolina Council of Churches. And we are very excited about the presentation this morning. We see a lot of new names that maybe are not familiar with PHW. So I'm going to give you just a very quick summary before we move into the main program. Partners in Health and Wholeness started 11 years ago through Blue Cross Blue Shield and the Kate B. Reynolds Foundation through the North Carolina Council of Churches to help North Carolinians learn more about chronic illnesses and the behaviors, lifestyle choices that can have an impact on both the diagnosis and the symptoms of chronic illness. And we've been working for 11 years directly with faith communities all across the state in their health programming. And that is as varied as our state is, but there's tons of information on our website if you're interested in learning more about some of what these folks are doing. But we primarily have concentrated on healthier eating, active living, freedom from nicotine, and mental health. About 3 years ago, and we always talk with our faith communities and we do official surveys every year, and we were hearing so much about the need for additional mental health resources, especially in our rural counties. We were hearing a lot of stress and challenges related to what has sometimes been referred to as the sandwich generation, folks who are trying to help out elderly parents and they're raising children and they're working. And so we went very deeply with our funders' support, the Duke Endowment, into expanding our mental health offerings and really focusing on healthy aging. And thanks to the Open Society Foundation up in New York, we were also able to start work 3 years ago around the overdose crisis in North Carolina. So those are the main things we work on. And if something happens like a global pandemic, we also respond very quickly with our partners across the state, including the Department of Health and Human Services, in getting out accurate information, working alongside faith communities. Nicole Johnson led an effort for us this year that we were so proud of. The faith communities had over 200 respond almost immediately with willingness to be vaccination rollout sites. So I can't overstate the impact that you make in our state and for our fellow folks. And we are here as a partner. So we have a presentation today, but we're going to put some links in the chat with our contact information, with websites for more information about Partners in Health and Wholeness. One thing I always forget is we also offer mini grants. So we offer a $1,000 grant per year, or a community grant that is up to $5,000. And that is just to support any health and wholeness initiative that falls within those areas that we talked about. So if you are interested, if you're unfamiliar with PHW, please reach out to us after this presentation or whenever you're ready, and we would love to talk with you. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Nicole Johnson and our presenter, Sarah Ogletree. And Sarah is spending her last day with the North Carolina Council of Churches
Yeah.
working with PHW. We are very grateful for her presence. We will miss her very much, and she can tell you where she's going and how you can keep in touch with this work. So thank you. Over to you, Nicole.
All right, thank you. As we do with all of our sacred conversations, we're going to open with just kind of a centering prayer meditation. And this is going to be the second time for one of these sacred conversations that I've chosen to share with you a poem from Mary Oliver. And I felt like it was particularly fit today. And it's called The Summer Day. So I'm going to read it, and I'll invite you to just quietly listen and maybe offer your own prayers. And then we will all say amen together. The summer day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Amen. So today we have with us Sarah Ogletree, and as Chris mentioned, it is her last day with us, so it feels particularly poignant for her to be talking with us about faith and health and the environment and where she has found herself. Sarah Ogletree, she's currently, and today's her last day in this position. She is the program coordinator for North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light program at the council. She is also a fellow alumna. She and I went to Wake Forest School of Divinity. So she has training in religious leadership and ecology. She also has training in sustainable development from Appalachian State. She has done just a myriad of things at the intersection of faith and health for at least a decade. She's partnered with lots of different organizations, Creation Justice Network of the UCC Southern Conference, Presbyterians for Earth Care, the Creation Care Alliance of Western North Carolina, and I have news about that part. But this is where she finds herself. This is where she spends some of her wild and precious life, talking about faith and health and the environment, social, environmental, and climate impacts and their relationships to energy, food, and the world that we live in. Sarah is going to be continuing that work. She is going to become the next director of the Creation Care of Western North Carolina. And we are very, very happy that this is happening, and also very sad because she's leaving us. And I will let her tell everyone some more about that. And then she's going to talk to us more today about what it looks like, what her journey has been in kind of faith and the environment. And we did have a survey for people to submit questions, like what are your questions around like faith and the environment? What are the questions that sometimes you don't want to ask? Because I call it, you don't want to sound like the one who doesn't know the things. You know what I mean? You don't want to sound like maybe I'm the only person who doesn't know the answer to this, because there are questions about what it looks like to what does it look like to care for creation? What does it look like? What kind of things do I do? Like, does it really make a difference if I use like energy efficient light bulbs in my car? I mean, does that really matter? And what about like daily survival, and where does that match up with the environment, and how does this all work together? So she's going to talk about her journey and also some questions that we came up with, but I really want to encourage everybody to ask your questions that you might have about this intersection of faith and the environment, and what you can do individually, what you can advocate for in your communities, what your communities can do, and what it looks like to be caretakers of creation. I know it's a used phrase, but it fit when we first put together the series, Caretakers of Creation. So without further ado, Sarah Ogletree.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's really wonderful to be with you, friends and colleagues, and to talk about this piece of my wild and precious life, and hopefully a piece of your all's as well, as we strive to care for each other and care for this world that we belong to, this world that we are a part of. I am transitioning to a new role at the Creation Care Alliance of Western North Carolina, but I will remain a resource. We primarily do serve folks in the western part of our state, but we have resources on our website. I do want you to know that you can still reach out to me as I transition, and I will continue to be a partner to the Partners in Health and Wholeness crowd and North Carolina Council of Churches and NCIPL. All of those groups will continue to work together. So this is not an ending, it is just a new chapter in this work and in our relationship to each other and to how we do this work together. That said, as Nicole said, we didn't have questions in that submission form, but we did talk about some questions that have come up for us in the work that we do from folks that we work with. So I'm going to strive to answer those questions. Please also write your questions in the chat. I'm sitting at my kitchen table right now, and I would like to think that we're all just sort of sitting around a table having a conversation and thinking and learning together. So this is informal, conversational, just an opportunity to think about what creation care is. Please feel free to ask any questions you have, questions about my journey and questions about how you can be a part of this work, whatever that might be. But before I get into some of those kind of basic, those questions that come up a lot, Nicole and I did want to just offer some context for how I got involved in this work. So I want to tell you just a little bit of my story, and I do think that stories matter in our work, period, just sort of how we came to be who we are and the values that led us to where we are. So my story, as someone working at the intersection of faith and environment, doing the work of creation care, really began where I grew up. I grew up in Western North Carolina, about 15 minutes from the Blue Ridge Parkway, from the Great Smoky Mountains. I was, just seated within this deeply beautiful place, within a deeply beautiful section of Southern Appalachia. I also grew up in church. So I grew up at First Baptist Church of Sylva. And growing up in the church and in this deeply beautiful, creation, these mountains and rivers and just really pristine ecosystems, kind of seated within me, I think, the desire to do the work that I do today. Because I was in church, I had the language of the sacred and language of God, of finding God in the world. And because I was in those mountains, it was really easy for me to see the divine in creation. I think we all have a place, that does that to us, whether it's the ocean when we're standing on the beaches and we just feel the bigness and the beauty and the awe of God, the awe of this world. For me, that was where I grew up. That was standing on top of a mountain and just that clear connection that I had to God in those spaces. So as a young child, I started to really connect my faith to creation, to the fullness of these places that I was growing up in and that I loved so deeply. But that didn't really become a calling, I would say, a calling to care for creation until I went to Appalachian State. So I went to Appalachian State University for undergrad. I had kind of planned on being an English major, like to read and write. But that got derailed by a class that I took on sustainable development. And in that class, I knew about climate change, but I didn't know how significant climate change was. I didn't understand the vastness or the severity of the climate crisis. So I learned about that in that class. I learned about other environmental issues like mountaintop removal coal mining, which is a process of coal mining that blasts the tops of mountains with dynamite, from their top, pushes them into the valley, covering headwater streams, covering, community graveyards, everything that's been there, poisons those spaces, and obviously also really harms those communities. So I learned about practices like that. And I learned that, I guess most notably, I learned that environmental degradation, environmental issues, water pollution, air pollution, climate change, all of this was happening in a big way right now. I think for a long time, we talked about our children. We said, our grandchildren, we want to preserve the world for them. And and that's true, we do. But it also became clear to me that children right now, parents right now, grandparents right now were being impacted by environmental issues. We're dying. People were losing their lives. And it was also a justice issue. Indigenous communities, Black and Brown communities, those were the folks that were bearing the brunt of environmental degradation, of pollution, and of the climate crisis. And they were also the folks who had contributed the least to the problem. Also communities in poverty bearing the brunt of this moment. So that class really changed the trajectory of my life. It didn't mean I didn't like reading and writing anymore, but it gave me something to read and write about. It really did kind of change my course. And I think as a person of faith, this really struck me in a big way because I was taught as a child in the church to love my neighbor as myself. And I was taught as a child in the church, Matthew 25 was a big verse talking about the least of these. How do we ensure that we're feeding the hungry and giving water to the thirsty, welcoming the stranger? All of those things were impacted by the climate crisis and by environmental issues. I couldn't love my neighbor in the way that I wanted to love my neighbor if I wasn't loving the air that we breathe or the water we drink or the ground in which our food is grown. Love is tangible. It's loving our lungs and our stomachs, our bodies. So that was a calling. Thinking about Matthew 25, we know that the climate crisis means migration crises, means that people have to leave their homes. How do we welcome the stranger? That's a question. We know that the climate crisis leads to more severe drought, more severe storms. That impacts agriculture. How do we feed the hungry? We know that climate change as it leads to drought, that impacts our water availability. How do we give water to the thirsty? Just et cetera, et cetera. This was connected so much to what I felt called to in my faith. And when I talk about climate, I'm partially emphasizing that because that was the big thing in my kind of vocational journey that led me to this calling of urgency. But what I'm naming about loving our neighbors and loving the least of these is also true for other environmental issues, for localized air pollution, localized water pollution. Environmental issues impact our health, and they impact our ability to care for each other, to care for our communities, and also to care for ourselves. And I feel strongly that that's the work that God calls us to. God calls us to loving, our neighbors as ourselves, to loving God, and God loves this world deeply. We know that in Genesis, and we know that throughout the biblical text. So as a person of faith, I was sort of astounded that all of these environmental issues were happening, that all of this pain and suffering was happening, and that the church in my experience, hadn't really been talking about that. We had been talking about poverty, we had been talking about how to love people, but we hadn't made those environmental connections to the work. And so that kind of became what I wanted to do. As a college student, I started working with congregations to have these conversations. And it ultimately led me to divinity school, where I did get a master's of divinity, focusing in religious leadership and ecology. And I think that that's really what validated my calling was, I was this kind of weird person sort of in undergrad, who was like, yeah, I'm making connections between faith and the environment. And people thought that was cool, but they also didn't really have much to offer me. They were like, that's great. But they weren't, saying, here's some resources to help you do that. I was kind of having to piece all of that together myself. And I was sort of on the margins of those conversations. But when I went to divinity school, I found that environmental ministry isn't new. People have been doing this for a long time. I mean, St. Francis of Assisi was doing this a very long time ago. But we also have incredible environmental theologians and activists and people who are doing the work of faith and creation care, who've been doing this for a long time. So folks like Fred Bonson, who was my advisor at Wake Forest, Norman Wurzba at Duke Divinity School, Ellen Davis at Duke Divinity School, Rosemary Radford Ruther, Sally McFaig, John Sabrino, Leonardo Boff. I mean, the list just goes on of incredible people doing this work in a faithful way. Just to offer up a resource, there's a great book called The Green Bible. It is the Bible. It's not just a book, it's the Bible, the Green Bible. And it's like a red letter Bible. And some of you may have grown up with red letter Bibles where Jesus's words are in red. I had one of those growing up. The Green Bible is a book where environmental passages and passages that connect to creation care are in green. Desmond Tutu, various faith leaders, some of the folks I just named, Ellen Davis, were all contributors. They added essays in the beginning. And then you have this really beautiful resource. So this wasn't new work. That really helped me find my way in the work, and helped me, I guess, get to where I am coming out of divinity school to do this work in a professional way. So what I've been doing to wrap up this kind of piece of context, what I've been doing professionally is working with congregations, folks like you, pastors, lay people, community members who want to connect their faith to the work of environmental ministry, who want to love people in a holistic way that connects them to the fullness of the creation that they belong to, and who want to love this world in a deep way. And I do that in a variety of ways by helping folks think about preaching opportunities or worship, by helping people connect to advocacy opportunities, to policy, by helping people think about how they might use their land, their church land, or their personal land in a sustainable way. Sort of a consulting, I guess, is some of what I've done. But really just, being a resource to the community, and striving to educate, inspire, and mobilize folks to do this work alongside us.
I want to pull out something real quick
Yeah.
that you said early on there, Sarah, and I know you've got more to say.
Mhm.
So you said that before you started hearing about faith and the environment and when you went to college, you felt like you weren't hearing about this sort of intersection of faith and health before, in your church, right?
Yeah.
Growing up, hearing about creation, hearing it emphasized. Do you still feel like that's the case? Do you still feel like in faith communities across our state, across the world, across the country, do you still feel like faith and the environment is not as woven together as you feel like it should be?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that people are starting to talk a lot more about this. I think it's less common for a faith community or a congregation to not know the term creation care, or to not know that that's something that, some folks are really interested in. Even if maybe their congregation isn't involved, it does seem like just kind of the consciousness around these issues has been raised. I feel like that's true across the board in faith communities, but also just in the general public. I think we know more now than we did 10 years ago. And there is more just like public knowledge around environmental issues, climate, whatever it may be. People really have become more educated on these issues. That said, I definitely do think that there's still a lot of room to grow. I think, one of the things about environmental issues that I think gives us an opportunity in all of our faith communities and all of our work is that this really is connected to everything that we do and everything we talk about. So when we have a poverty ministry, a ministry addressing poverty, one of the reasons that people can become impoverished is because of environmental issues. And impoverished people feel the impacts of environmental issues most severely, along with Black and Brown folks. So when we recognize those connections, that intersectionality, we're able to have deeper conversations and conversations that get to the root problem So it shifts that charity from charity to justice, that kind of opportunity of thinking about the problem. We have to help people where they are and give them what they need in those moments. But also, why are people in the situations they're in? Why don't they have clean water to drink? I mean, we think about Flint, Michigan. We think about in our own communities. There's a community, Walnut Cove, North Carolina, that's dealt with poisoning from coal ash. So when we think about that and we get to that root problem, that provides us an opportunity in our ministries to more holistically serve communities. Does that help and that make sense?
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
All right, I will.
I just think there's an opportunity. If we're talking about poverty, there's also an opportunity to talk about environmental racism. If we're talking about and to think about how impoverished communities are sacrificed. When we think about toxic waste industry, they are located in impoverished communities and Black and Brown communities. That's an intentional location that sacrifices these communities and that hurts them. So there's an opportunity to go deeper. But I do think that the consciousness is shifting and that more congregations are having these conversations.
Okay. All right. I don't want to derail you. All right. I just wanted to pull that one out just a little bit.
Sure.
And just before we continue, I want to ask, so for like the people on this call right now, you can be free to unmute yourselves. Do you feel like in the faith communities with which you are associated or affiliated, do you feel like this intersection of kind of like faith and the environment is something that is talked about? Is it just talked about? Is there sort of call to action? Is there active participation in what that looks like in living out your faith? I'm just putting that out there. I don't know if anybody would like to say yes or no or give their input, but I just wanted to say, what does it look like in your faith community?
A thumbs up or a thumbs down on your reactions on Zoom.
Or put it in the chat. Kim put something in the chat.
So Kim says it's still considered boutique or special interest rather than the whole congregation. I think that's very true, Kim. Jessica says very much at Binkley Baptist. Yes, Binkley Baptist is absolutely leading in this kind of work. And I think Kim's comment, which I want to just kind of highlight for a minute, that's something that Fred Bonson talked a lot about, this sort of boutiqueness of creation care, and how he talked about how a lot of people see ministry as like a potluck. And there's all these different things. There's like hunger ministry, poverty ministry, environmental ministry, and you get what you want on your plate, but we don't necessarily see creation care as a central main dish of what it means to live our faith. And his argument was that it is. And I think part of that is because we really, in terms of our faith education, haven't been offered that kind of background of how this is a central issue. I talked about love your neighbor as yourself in Matthew 25, but there's also verses like Genesis 2:15, which is the Lord God took the human and placed them in the garden to till it and keep it. And if we look at till and keep in Hebrew, those words are avad and shamar, and they can also be translated as preserve and protect. So Ellen Davis, who is an Old Testament scholar at Duke Divinity, talks about how this verse really is our first human job description, to preserve and protect creation. And we, of course, as humans, belong to creation. So to preserve and protect each other and our relationships to the entirety of the world. And I think that when we recognize that a part of how we love each other, which we know is central to our faith, is also how we love and care for creation, the fullness of our ecosystem, then we start to move away from that kind of boutique orientation to something that's a bit more centered.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So just a couple more things I wanted to know, and then I really do want to hear what your questions might be. First, I just kind of want to take a step back, which is not a question that Nicole and I pre-approved, but I'm going to go off course for a minute. And I just want to take a step back and also talk about what creation care is. because I think, I've talked about a lot of environmental issues, and they do all fall within this kind of broad context of creation care. But there are folks doing creation care who probably wouldn't talk about climate. There are folks doing creation care who are, very localized, and there's people who are doing policy work, who are calling their senators. So there's lots of different ways that this manifests. And how I would define creation care is striving to care for the fullness of the creation to which we belong. So a part of that is coming to see ourselves as a part of creation. It's not separate from creation. It's part of it's, this sort of identity piece, seeing ourselves as a part of the creation. And then caring for others and for ourselves from that location, from this place of being a part of creation. That can look like so many things. So just to give you some examples of things that congregations, I've seen different congregations do. Some congregations are really invested in food ministry and they have a community garden. Maybe they have a pantry for folks. Maybe they're putting on their land edible agriculture, they're edible landscaping, edible landscaping, like berry bushes and different things for folks to be able to come and enjoy. That's a part of creation care. That's a part of caring for this world and each other in a beautiful way. There are people who are doing permaculture, who are, looking at their land and trying to collect rain barrels, that kind of work. That's also creation care. Policy work is creation care. Calling your senators and asking for them to do what is loving for people and places. That is creation care. Preaching on environmental issues, that's creation care. Teaching on environmental issues, that's creation care. So this can look like so many different things. And there's so many different entry points to this conversation. And I just want to name that because this can get a bit overwhelming. And Nicole and I did talk about that. We talked about how all of the need that surrounds environmental issues can be overwhelming. And then all of the ways to respond can be overwhelming, because how do you pick? How do you decide what you do? And so what I want to offer in that respect is that the best way to figure out where you start is by figuring out where your energy is and where your gifts are and where there's need, and where those things come together, your energy and your gifts and need. That's a great place to start. If that's food, that's wonderful. If that's policy, that's wonderful. If that's writing, letters to the editor, that's wonderful. But figuring out, your particular piece, and you can also think about that for your congregation, your individual voice and your congregation's gifts and the needs that they can respond to. I think that can be a helpful sort of discernment tool, thinking about your energy, your gifts, and where the need intersects. And then starting there. We don't have to do everything. We can't do everything. We don't need to do everything. We just need to be a part of a solution that's multifaceted. So I also wanted to offer that. Are there any questions before I kind of keep rolling? Joy says, I am active in connecting with our government officials and telling them that stewardship of our planet is my highest priority. And I encourage them to show that in their voting. Yeah, and that's creation care. And one of the things that we really encourage at NCIPL, and that I encourage as an individual, when we are people of faith are calling our elected officials, many of our elected officials are also people of faith. So saying, I am calling you because of my faith and my values to love people and love my community and love this planet. And I know that in order to have a beautiful and a compassionate and a livable future, we need to act on this. And I think using that language of morality, that language of values really helps. And it's an important piece to name, I think, when we do call our legislators. Let's see, another comment here. Let me look. A member of Audubon, the World Wildlife Foundation, charter member of International Museum of African Americans, member of Museum for Native American Indians. Wow, I planted 12 flowering trees, native milkweed, brown-eyed Susans. So placing beehives on the farm. All of this is such a great example of that kind of like multifaceted creation care. So thank you. Who wrote this? This is a great example. So this shows various approaches to doing this kind of work. Being involved with organizations that are doing this work, like the World Wildlife Foundation and Audubon, great organizations, but also localizing by planting trees and milkweed and helping our bee population repopulate. Many of you likely know that, our bees are really struggling. So that's a really beautiful example. And being a member of these various museums that are highlighting and uplifting the perspectives of African American folks and Indigenous peoples, I mean, all of that is just wonderful. So thank you, Joy, for those really tangible examples.
Mhm.
That's great. So a couple more things I want to name, and then I'll see what other questions we might have. Is a little bit about this. Does what we do matter? Nicole brought this up.
Yes.
Do our individual actions really matter when the problem is as big as it is? And I want to say yes, and here's why. So our individual actions, things like so for me, how this work impacts my life. It impacts what I buy. It impacts where my money with my job, like my retirement fund, that kind of stuff gets invested. It impacts the food that I purchase, who I buy it from. I really try to purchase food from local farmers when possible. And I know that I'm privileged and have ability to do that because I have the finances to do that. So that's another conversation too, is access. I turn my lights off when I'm not in my house and when I'm not in a room. I compost my food waste for the most part. Sometimes I get lazy, and we all have our issues and our struggles. So I'll be honest with you and say that sometimes I don't do that very well. But I strive to compost. I strive to recycle well. I strive to call my senators. My senators and my legislators are saved in my phone. And so I call them with regularity about issues like Joy was naming. I strive to do that. I also strive to garden and to do those kinds of things. Again, I know that, we do what we have gifts for and what we have the ability to do. And I know that privilege can come into this as well. But those are some of the ways this impacts my life. I do think that those things matter because what we really need in our society is a culture shift. We really need to shift away from a value system that doesn't value people and that doesn't value land and places. That currently our system really does put profit above people and health and land and clean water. And in order for us to shift that, we as society members have to shift how we interact in the world. That said, corporations are responsible for 70% of the emissions in our country. And so we also have to hold corporations accountable and really, for those of us who feel called to that kind of advocacy that Joy was naming, hold those folks accountable, write them letters or, get on Twitter, whatever your kind of means for doing that is. But individual actions matter because individual actions help us with that culture shift, and it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Caring for your local, your front yard. Let's just say it's just that. It's just your front yard. Caring for that little piece of land makes a difference for the ecosystem that surrounds you, the plants, the animals, and for your health. It contributes to the health of your own life as you help clean your own air and your own water. So even that, these very small things have tangible difference, tangible impact as well. Driving a hybrid vehicle, yeah.
Yeah, so we had a couple of comments in the chat, like somebody saying, they feel guilty when they don't have the budget to buy sustainable clothes or foods, but they feel like you're saying that's okay. There are other things they can do, like call their legislators. And then somebody was agreeing that an attitude heart change is definitely needed, and that's where they think faith leaders can be effective, I guess, in the framing in which we talk about faith in the environment and how important that might be, and caring for creation, and putting sort of a theological language that helps people to think practically and also imagine what that can look like. And then there's also somebody mentioning driving a hybrid vehicle, an electric car. I'm going to say I don't have one of those because definitely out of my price range. And then someone else is mentioning that doing some of the personal things you were mentioning has led them to learn more and pay attention to the big things like policy. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that's all really good feedback. And it is true, for the folks who are naming that we can feel guilty when we don't have the ability to do some of these things. There really are so many things that we can do, and so many ways that we can make a difference, including calling legislators, including, putting up a bird feeder, and also including how we talk about these issues. When we help folks understand that creation also includes humans, that caring for the environment is a part of caring for each other, just that kind of language shift, that kind of culture shift, that matters too, just those conversations. So I want to talk a little bit about what faith communities specifically can do. And these are examples, I already hit on this a little bit, but these are examples from my own experience of things that faith communities have done. And I just, maybe as you're listening, for those of you who are thinking about your own faith community or just thinking about your own individual life, you can think about what you might want to do, or if any of these things specifically connect to you or give you some ideas. So a couple of things that I've seen folks do. There's a lot that can be done. First of all, there is a group at Parkway United Church of Christ in Winston-Salem that meets to have a study on the book Drawdown, which is a book about various ways to make a difference related to environmental issues. So they have a study, and then they also are doing various kinds of landscape preservation and stewardship on their property. So they've created a prayer trail that goes through their woods so that people can experience the beauty of creation and can become reacquainted with creation. They have planted native plants that can provide food for the native species that live in that area, food and habitat. So they have done that. They've planted native plants and created a healthy natural system on their church property that's also very beautiful. They've collected rainwater. So they're doing all of that on their property, in addition to having that kind of continuous Sunday school conversation about things that they can do, and to preaching regularly. And this is just one example of a congregation, but I was a member of Parkway UCC when I was in divinity school. And so I'm just uplifting that example that I firsthand witnessed. That was really, really beautiful. They preach regularly on creation care as well. So those are a couple examples. Food ministry is another example. So for those of you who live in the Triangle and the Triad, there's a great example through RAFI called the Farm to Church program of churches who are partnering with farmers of color to participate in community-supported agriculture conversations and programs. And so what that means is that congregations are buying shares of local food from farmers of color, and then are having access to that local food for their congregants, while also supporting people and caring for land well and supporting people of color. So again, that's a justice solution, a food solution, and food is a huge part of how we care for creation. So that Farm to Church program, I think, is another really beautiful example, and a lot of churches in the Raleigh area are participating in that. A couple other examples. Let's see. There are some churches who actually allow farmers to come in to their land and farm there. There are churches who have little farmers markets on Sundays. When you leave the church, there are churches that have pollinator gardens, kind of like Parkway UCC, that are, planting perennial flowers and species that can really help that local environment thrive. Education is another big piece of this. So earlier, Nicole put into the chat some books that are great for book studies. A lot of churches are having book studies or Sunday school conversations about these issues. Some great books include Making Peace with the Land by Norman Wurzba and Fred Bonson. The Green Bible has a study guide. Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture by Ellen Davis is a really good one. Green Faith by Reverend Fletcher Harper. And I can make sure that these are accessible to you. Many of them are in the chat. But there's lots of congregations that are reading these books, talking about them, and then thinking, okay, how do we move from this into some form of action that fits us, right? That fits our skill set, our just who we are as a congregation, and that connects us to serving our community in a way that feels right to who we are. There's a lot of congregations that are really focused on children's ministry are also emphasizing getting kids outside. That's another way that we care for creation is by teaching kids about our world and by teaching them how to care for creation. So gardening projects with the children in your congregation, going on nature walks and teaching them about how God loves this world and God loves them and they're a part of this world and isn't that beautiful? That's another way that we can care for creation and help instill those values that help us create that more beautiful world. I want to check my little notes here and make sure I'm not forgetting anything really valuable. Yeah, so here's a couple more things that I wanted to name. Energy efficiency is a really accessible way that congregations can make a big difference. So I know we think about solar panels. We think about, how we like that's a big flashy thing. And if your congregation can go solar, that is definitely something that you all should be doing. But not everybody can do that right now. There are great resources to help congregations do that, especially if your provider is Duke Energy. They have a program specifically for nonprofits to go solar that can help you do that and make that financially feasible. But energy efficiency is very feasible. So switching light bulbs to LEDs, that can drastically reduce your energy bill. And also that's a way that we care for creation and each other. When we turn on our lights, we shouldn't be harming the planet or harming communities. And so we do that less when we are using LEDs and using bulbs that don't take up as much energy. You can also get an energy audit, and CIPL offers free energy audits by incredible volunteer engineers and folks in that kind of world. And they'll help you think about ways that you can change and accessible ways that you can move towards being more energy efficient, which will again save money and save resources and help you love your neighbor. So that's another accessible one. Composting is a great one. Zero Waste Church is a great resource to pay attention for composting in churches. And then a big one is divesting from fossil fuels. So a lot of our retirement funds, and for those of us who are privileged enough to have funds like that, are funding fossil fuel projects. And when I say fossil fuels, I mean oil and gas and various infrastructure that we know isn't as sustainable or helpful. It's contributing to the problem. So talking to the congregation, a lot of denominations are divesting from fossil fuels or taking their money out of that. Seeing if your denomination is one of those denominations is one way that you can also make a big difference. And the last thing I want to name, and then we'll do any kind of last questions. Oh, some really good resources just got put in the chat too. So there you go. Some really good various things that you can do in organizations you can work with. Ways that you can different groups that you can be connected to that can help you stay in touch or think about these issues include the North Carolina Conservation Network, RAFI, Rural Advancement Foundation International. They work on agriculture and policy and various, they're the ones doing the Farm to Church program, connecting churches to farmers of color. The Creation Care Alliance, where I'll be in Western North Carolina, NCIPL certainly, Piedmont Environmental Alliance, just Sierra Club, some of the groups that were already named. There's a lot of really, really great groups. Green Faith is a faith-based group that's really wonderful. The North Carolina Composting Council can help you as well if you're interested in composting. North Carolina Environmental Justice Network is a great one, focused in the eastern part of our state. And also Mountain True is another organization. Native Plants of North Carolina group. Thank you, Joy. That's wonderful. So I can make sure that we send out those resources, but I wanted to just name them since we do have a recording. And then I think we do have a few minutes here for any kind of lingering questions.
So I do want to say, so what about those folks who say, sure, we can talk about helping kids get reacquainted with their environment, or learning to feeling wonder about being outside, or if they can't, or in the ways people spend money. What about people who say, the way we've been doing things hasn't been working, you know, or people who say there's a reason we say climate crisis. Crisis implies action now to change what's wrong or what needs changing. And some folks would say, you know, oh, just, you know, talking about it in your church, or coming up with a plan to plant a garden, or doing those kinds of things is not enough. I might be one of those people, but
Yeah. So I think, you know,
not even close, right?
mhm. Oh, Nicole, you asked me this
Sorry.
question with 10 minutes left, and this is a huge question.
Mhm.
So I think what I would say is, first of all, I recognize that not everybody is living in that world. Not everybody is, you know, a climate activist. And you can do great work without being a climate activist. But yes, the climate crisis is urgent. And so how do we respond to that urgency in a way that doesn't burn us out, and in a way that we are making a difference? So I guess how I would respond to that is that we do need a multifaceted strategy. So local action matters, because local action does help us. Local action does make our communities safer and stronger and more resilient when climate impacts like storms and drought affect us. That's going to help us. So all of the ways that we can act locally it really does matter. And yes, we need to call our legislators. Yes, we need to advocate for policy change. You know, we need to do both those kind of systemic pieces and those local pieces. And I want to just stress that very quickly this can become, again, very overwhelming. And it's easy to get really burnt out or depressed, or just kind of despondent when we think about all the things that need to be done in such a short period of time. And so I really do just want to emphasize, I firmly believe that everything that we're doing matters. It matters in ways that we understand, I think, and in ways that we don't, because I understand God as holy mystery and bigger than I can ever understand. So I really do believe that when we contribute good to the world, locally, systemically, politically, however that may be, we are a part of something bigger than we know. And I'm not trying to not emphasize urgency, but I also think that urgency can just lead us to burnout. You know, for a long time, I focused on the urgency so much that I wasn't taking care of myself or my family or the people in my community. And that wasn't helping either. So there's a balance. And I think part of the balance for me that's been helpful, this is, you know, really me sharing my own kind of story in this. Part of the balance that's been helpful is this trust in the larger story, you know, trusting that the good that we do contributes to good that we won't even ever get to see. So it's sort of that mentality of, you know, planting a sequoia tree. You know, you're never going to see that tree grow, but you plant it because you do have hope. You do have hope. And hope isn't optimism. Hope isn't cheap. Hope is just choosing to continue to try to do good work in this world. I don't know if that's super helpful, but that's what's been helpful to me is, yes, there's urgency. We need to do all these different pieces, and we need to care for ourselves and care for each other so that we can keep showing up. A part of that too is going to sleep at night and knowing that somebody else is waking up to do good work. So trusting in community, you know, trusting in the community of people striving to do good work. And again, remembering that all of this work is connected. So when we make When we make strides, when we achieve something, that has ripples, and that's positive. Eugene, do you have a question? I saw your hand go up. Maybe you just froze.
I think he's frozen, maybe.
Okay.
We have just a few minutes here, so I want to ask, does anyone have any questions? Please ask them. I know we're about 6 minutes, but we can go over a little bit. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask?
So I have a question.
Okay.
I had a question about any specific interfaith or Buddhist groups that are doing environmental care, specifically, Buddhist congregations. I don't represent a church. I'm representing my business, and I'm kind of exploring different ideas. So I am a massage therapist, and I practice traditional Thai massage, and Thai medical theory has its roots in Buddhist traditions. So, I'm looking for ways to incorporate an interfaith aspect in, and include, just running a business that is, environmentally conscious. So I don't know if you have any connections.
Yeah, I don't. Also, hi, Anna. Anna was my friend when I lived near Wilkesboro. Good to see you. You're still my friend. I just haven't seen you in a while. But yes, so I don't have a specific congregation to name, and I wish that I did. I hope that I will in the future. But who I would name is Joanna Macy. And you may have read Joanna Macy, but she's a great writer and thinker, an activist who comes from a Buddhist perspective, and does think about ecological issues well. Hi, Tara. And I think that she would absolutely be a helpful resource. And she has an organization called Work That Reconnects, which I would recommend to anyone, really. It's an interfaith, multi-faith organization that I think helps in a lot of ways do what Nicole and I were just talking about, which is process the enormity of this and continue showing up to the work in a way that doesn't burn us out. So I would recommend Work That Reconnects and Joanna Macy. I also just wanted to name something in my notes that I didn't get to that I think is important, is there are people, who don't want to talk about this issue because they think it's political. And I just want to name that I think that what they're actually worried about is they think that it's partisan. And I am open to pushback on that. But I think that typically people are worried about it being partisan, not about it being political. Because politics are just part of how we show people love in the world. We get laws passed that help people live in a way that's beautiful and kind and where they're respected. And so a partisan perspective is problematic, but a political perspective is just a part of how we engage in caring for each other in this world. And so I think that can be helpful for us when folks say, well, that's too political. Saying, well, we're not being partisan. We're striving to have moral conversations about values in this world and to help protections and policies be put into action that will care for people and places in a loving way. I think that can be a helpful reframe. And so I also wanted to offer that. Yeah, and Kim's right also. Some solutions will be partisan and they'll be controversial, and I don't want to not acknowledge that. So you're also right. But it is important to make sure people understand the difference between political, which is community-based, and partisan. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Any lingering questions? And for Anna, who asked the question, we would definitely, we would like to follow up with you. I think that would be really great. So I would just want to make sure that I got that. So you were looking for resources around incorporating better environmental practices in your business, but incorporating a sort of spirituality aspect from a a Buddhist kind of a Buddhist framing. Is that accurate? I just want to make sure
So yeah, so I'm trying to kind of create a cultural immersion experience, because I do have that's, and we can talk more about this, but that's
Okay.
kind of what where my brain goes right now,
Okay. Okay.
with a toddler. So
I've got a 2-year-old running around here. No worries.
there are a lot of different aspects of it, but yeah, I'm just because my little town of Wilkesboro,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
very, and I happen to be practicing this type of
Oh.
Alex. Say hello.
Oh, hi.
So I want ways to invite people into some of the history, and some of the the depth of this modality that is very spiritual, from a community and a place that is Buddhist, and making that connection for people, I think, is interesting and also just helpful.
Okay.
Larger conversations.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure that I got that so we could do like follow up appropriately.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? We're going to be wrapping up. It is 12:01. If there are any other questions, we will be sending follow-up resources to all of the folks on this call. There was a part 1, and that one was a conversation with Dr. Meberg, who works at Wake Forest University in the sustainability program, and had also worked at the EPA. So there's a part 1, and then this was part 2, and we'll be sending out copies of the recording as well as listing of resources from both those people who participated, Sarah and Stan, and we'll be sending out like links to articles, videos, organizations, that sort of thing, as well as follow-up contact information for folks. And if there are no final questions, we're going to be closing out. We're going to do a closing. It's become kind of a Partners in Health and Wholeness tradition, I call it now. We're going to do what's called 3 deep breaths. I'm going to invite people to kind of ground themselves in the spaces where they are. Take a moment just to kind of breathe deeply, just for a minute. We're going to take 3 deep breaths, and I'm going to start off counting on 1. And if there's things that you're thinking about or things that you're considering, to hold those openly in your heart and in your mind. And then after we do that, we're going to invite everybody to unmute themselves. We'll stay on for a few minutes if there are extra questions, or if folks just want to be able to say goodbye to each other or talk to somebody who put something in our resources. That would be great. And then Elizabeth just reminded me, we do have another webinar coming up on Monday. And that one is going to be with our overdose crisis coordinator, Elizabeth Brewington. Actually, we'll just call her associate director for that, for our overdose crisis, and Jessica Stokes, who's the associate director for our mental health advocacy initiative. And that event is called Growing Communities of Inclusion, and talking about the connection between mental health and harm reduction. And the registration is in the chat. So if you can join us, I invite you to do that. So we're going to do the 3 deep breaths now. And I'll start off with 1. If you're sitting, just feel your body in the space where you are. If it helps you to close your eyes. Amen. Thank you, everybody, for coming on and for participating. I'll invite you to unmute yourselves, please. Feel free to do that. You should have the ability to unmute yourselves. If there are questions you want to ask, or if there's something you wanted to share, or if you just want to say goodbye, that's great too. But thank you for coming, and thank you for being present. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the ways that you did participate.
Thank y'all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, no.
Oh no, Miss Annie, you all right?
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.
You too. Bye-bye.